The amber glow of the faculty lounge at Oxford cast long shadows across worn leather chairs as evening settled over the ancient stones. Professor Margaret Chen had organized what she called impossible conversations, theatrical debates, where actors embodied history's greatest thinkers, bringing their ideas to life for students who had grown weary of textbooks and lectures. Tonight's encounter promised to be particularly explosive. The room held its breath as two figures entered from opposite doors. The first, tall and broad-shouldered with penetrating eyes, moved with the measured gait of someone accustomed to walking while thinking. His robe suggested ancient Greece, but his presence filled the modern space effortlessly. This was Plato, the philosopher who had shaped Western thought for over 2 millennia. From the other entrance came a smaller, more animated figure. His eyes sparkled with mischief and intelligence, his movements quick and expressive. Jean-Jacques Rousseau adjusted his simple coat and surveyed the room with the curiosity of someone who found wisdom in unexpected places. "Gentlemen," Professor Chen announced to the gathering of students and faculty, "tonight we explore one of education's most fundamental questions. Is learning about forming the soul or training citizens? Plato, Rousseau, the floor is yours." The two philosophers settled into their chairs, a small table between them holding nothing but water glasses and the weight of centuries of educational theory. Plato spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of the academy. "My friend Rousseau, though we are separated by 2,000 years, I suspect we both understand that education is humanity's most sacred trust. But I fear your century has forgotten what education truly means." Rousseau leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. "And I fear, dear Plato, that your lofty ideals have blinded you to what human beings actually are. You speak of forming souls as if we were sculptors working marble, but children are not stone. They are living, breathing creatures with their own nature." "Ah, but that is precisely my point," Plato replied, settling back in his chair. "The soul is not created by education, it exists eternally. Education merely awakens it to remember what it already knows. The soul yearns for truth, for beauty, for the good itself. Our role as educators is to guide it toward these eternal forms." A student in the front row shifted uncomfortably. The weight of such cosmic responsibility seemed almost overwhelming. Rousseau chuckled, a sound both warm and challenging. "You see, already you have these young minds worried about cosmic responsibilities when they should be learning to live as human beings among other human beings. Tell me, Plato, what good is a soul perfectly formed according to your ideals if it cannot function in the real world, if it cannot contribute to society, protect the vulnerable, build just institutions? But without the soul's proper formation," Plato countered, his voice rising slightly, "what kind of society do we create? One built on shadows and illusions? I have seen such societies, Rousseau. I watched Athens execute Socrates for asking questions. I watched democracy become mob rule. The unexamined life is not worth living, and an unexamined society is not worth preserving." The tension in the room grew palpable. Students leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing more than an academic exercise. This was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of human potential. Rousseau stood and began to pace, his energy barely contained. "But you misunderstand the problem entirely. Society corrupts us, yes, but not because our souls lack proper formation. We are corrupted because we abandon our natural goodness. Children are born pure, compassionate, curious. It is our institutions, our artificial hierarchies, our obsession with abstract ideals that twist them into something unrecognizable." "Natural goodness?" Plato's eyebrows rose. "My dear Jean-Jacques, have you observed children closely? Left to their natural impulses, they are selfish, impulsive, driven by appetite rather than reason. The soul has 3 parts: appetite, spirit, and reason. And without proper education, appetite rules all. This is why we need philosopher kings, not the rule of the naturally good masses." Professor Chen watched as her students began taking sides, some nodding at Plato's systematic approach, others drawn to Rousseau's faith in human nature. The debate was working exactly as she had hoped, forcing them to confront their own assumptions about learning and human development. Rousseau stopped pacing and faced Plato directly. "Philosopher kings, you would have us ruled by those who have been most thoroughly corrupted by abstract thinking, most removed from the simple truths of human experience. No, my friend. Education should prepare citizens who can think for themselves, who understand their duties to one another, who can preserve freedom rather than surrender it to enlightened despots." The battle lines were drawn. In one corner stood Plato, defender of eternal truths and the soul's ascent toward perfect knowledge. In the other, Rousseau, champion of natural development and democratic citizenship. The next 35 minutes would determine not just who won this particular debate, but how these students would think about education for the rest of their lives. The real fight was about to begin. Plato rose from his chair with deliberate grace, his movements carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades contemplating the deepest questions of existence. The firelight caught the intensity in his eyes as he prepared to lay out his vision of education's true purpose. Rousseau speaks of natural goodness, but he confuses the starting point with the destination. Yes, the soul possesses an innate capacity for truth and virtue, but this capacity means nothing without cultivation. Imagine a field capable of producing the finest wheat. Without proper tending, it yields only weeds. He moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening Oxford courtyard, as if seeing beyond it to some perfect realm. In my Republic, I described the allegory of the cave. Post-humans live chained in darkness, mistaking shadows on the wall for reality itself. Education is the painful process of breaking those chains, of turning the soul toward the light of true knowledge. A graduate student raised her hand tentatively. But Professor Plato, how do we know what constitutes true knowledge? Who decides what truths the soul should seek? Plato turned back to the room, his expression both patient and urgent. The soul itself decides, my dear student. Through dialectic, through rigorous questioning and reasoning, the soul recognizes truth when it encounters it. This is why education cannot be mere job training or civic preparation. It must be the systematic development of the soul's capacity to know the good, the beautiful, the just. Rousseau had been listening with growing agitation, his fingers drumming against his water glass. But listen to yourself, Plato. You speak as if education occurs in some ethereal realm, disconnected from the messiness of human life. These students will graduate and face real challenges: poverty, injustice, environmental crisis. What good does your perfect knowledge do if it cannot help them navigate the world as it actually exists? Everything. Plato's voice rang out with passionate conviction. If we do not first understand justice itself, how can we create just institutions? If we do not grasp the form of beauty, how can we create beautiful lives? The world as it exists is precisely the problem, Rousseau. It is a world of appearances, of constantly shifting opinions, of mob rule disguised as democracy. He began to pace now, his philosophical fervor building. Consider the current state of education. Students are taught to express their opinions as if all opinions were equally valid. They are trained in techniques and skills, but given no foundation for determining whether those techniques serve good or evil purposes. They graduate as sophisticated barbarians, clever but unwise, skilled but aimless. Professor Chen watched as several students shifted uncomfortably. Plato's words cut close to their own educational experience. The soul has an architecture, Plato continued, warming to his theme. Reason must rule over spirit, and spirit must govern appetite. Without this proper ordering, we produce either tyrants drunk on power or slaves addicted to pleasure. True education creates guardian souls, those capable of protecting themselves and others from the chaos of unexamined life. Rousseau could contain himself no longer. He sprang to his feet, his voice crackling with energy. Guardian souls? Protectors? You speak like a man who has never trusted ordinary people to govern themselves. Your philosopher kings are just sophisticated tyrants, convinced their abstract knowledge makes them fit to rule over the rest of us. And your natural citizens, Plato shot back, are just sophisticated children, convinced their feelings and impulses constitute wisdom. Tell me, Jean-Jacques, when the mob storms the Bastille or votes for demagogues promising easy solutions, where is this natural goodness you champion? The room fell silent. The historical weight of actual revolutions and democratic failures hung heavy in the air. Plato softened his tone slightly, but his conviction remained unshaken. I do not despise ordinary people, my friend. I despise the systems that keep them trapped in ignorance and call it freedom. The soul yearns to know truth, to understand its place in the cosmic order, to live in harmony with the eternal principles that govern reality. Education should honor this yearning, not corrupt it with relativism and pragmatism. He returned to his chair, leaning forward intently. When I speak of forming the soul, I mean awakening its capacity for wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. These are not arbitrary cultural constructs. They are the fundamental virtues without which no life can be truly human. A person who possesses these virtues will naturally become the kind of citizen any decent society needs. But who defines these virtues? Rousseau pressed. Who determines what counts as wisdom or justice? In practice, your system becomes a tool for the powerful to justify their dominance over the powerless. They claim to know the eternal truths, and everyone else must submit to their enlightened guidance. Plato smiled, the expression both patient and slightly condescending. The same person who defines mathematical truth, my dear Rousseau. No one defines it. It simply is. 2 + 2 = 4, whether we like it or not, whether it serves our interests or not, whether we understand it or not. Justice and virtue are no different. They exist independently of our opinions about them. The philosophical chasm between them was becoming clear. For Plato, education meant aligning the soul with eternal, objective truths. For Rousseau, such claims to eternal truth inevitably became weapons of oppression. The debate was far from over, and the stakes could not be higher. The very nature of human learning hung in the balance. Rousseau stood again, but this time his movement was slower, more thoughtful. He walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames for a moment before turning back to face both Plato and the assembled audience. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, less combative, more deeply personal. My friend Plato, you speak beautifully of eternal truths and perfect forms, but you have forgotten something crucial. Where do philosophers come from? They are not born knowing these eternal principles. They begin as children, and it is there, in childhood, that education either succeeds or fails. He moved closer to the students, his eyes scanning their faces. Look at these young people. Each one arrived at university having spent years in classrooms, memorizing facts, taking tests, competing for grades. How many of them still possess the natural curiosity they were born with? How many have learned to think for themselves, rather than simply repeat what their teachers have told them? An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the room. Several students exchanged glances, recognizing themselves in Rousseau's description. This is what I mean by corruption, Rousseau continued, his voice growing more animated. We take children who are naturally curious, naturally compassionate, naturally eager to learn, and we force them into artificial molds. We teach them to value external rewards over internal satisfaction, to compete rather than collaborate, to memorize rather than understand. Plato interjected, but surely you do not suggest we leave children entirely to their own devices, without structure, without guidance toward higher truths. They remain trapped in their immediate appetites and desires. No, not abandoned, Rousseau replied, settling into his chair but maintaining his energetic posture, but educated according to their nature, not against it. Watch a child encounter the natural world. They ask endless questions, they experiment, they learn through their senses and their experiences. This is how humans are designed to learn. He leaned forward, speaking directly to a young woman in the front row. Tell me, when did you learn the most in your life? When someone lectured you about abstract principles, or when you discovered something for yourself through experience? The student hesitated, then answered honestly, through experience, when I had to figure things out myself. Exactly! Rousseau's eyes lit up. The child is naturally active, naturally social, naturally moral, when not corrupted by false teachings. Our job as educators is not to impose external truths, but to create conditions where natural learning can flourish. Plato shook his head slowly. But Jean-Jacques, you are describing training, not education. You would have us produce skilled animals, not rational souls, without exposure to eternal principles, without rigorous dialectical training. How can the mind ever transcend its immediate circumstances? Transcend? Rousseau's voice sharpened. Why must we transcend our humanity rather than fulfill it? You speak as if the material world, the social world, the emotional world were prisons to escape, rather than the very context in which human flourishing occurs. He stood again, beginning to pace with renewed energy. Let me tell you what I see in your educational system, Plato. I see children forced to sit still for hours, memorizing abstract concepts they cannot relate to their lived experience. I see young people trained to defer to authority rather than think critically. I see citizens who have learned to be passive recipients of knowledge rather than active creators of understanding. Professor Chen noticed several faculty members shifting in their seats. Rousseau's critique was hitting close to home. And what kind of society does this produce? Rousseau continued. One where people accept inequality as natural, where they surrender their freedom to those who claim superior knowledge. where they become disconnected from their own moral instincts and rely on external authorities to tell them right from wrong. But without proper moral education, Plato countered, how do you propose to develop these moral instincts? The child left to nature becomes selfish and impulsive. The soul requires training in virtue, just as the body requires training in athletics. Rousseau paused in his pacing, a slight smile playing at his lips. Ah, but you assume children are naturally selfish. Have you observed them carefully, Plato? A young child who sees another child hurt will instinctively try to help. They share naturally before they are taught to hoard. They tell the truth before they learn to lie for advantage. These are merely impulses, Plato responded, not genuine virtue. True courage, true justice, true temperance require understanding, not just feeling. And I argue that true understanding grows from genuine feeling, properly cultivated. Rousseau shot back. When we teach children to ignore their natural compassion in favor of abstract principles, we create monsters capable of justifying any cruelty in the name of higher truths. The room fell silent as the weight of this accusation settled over them. Both philosophers were now standing, facing each other across an intellectual divide that seemed unbridgeable. Rousseau softened his tone, but maintained his conviction. Education should prepare citizens, Plato. Not philosopher kings who rule over others, but active participants in democratic society who can think for themselves, who understand their interconnectedness with others, who possess both the knowledge and the character necessary for self-governance. And how, Plato asked quietly, do you propose to achieve this without corrupting them with the very social prejudices and popular opinions that make self-governance impossible? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Rousseau smiled with the confidence of someone who had spent years developing his answer. Plato moved to the center of the room, his presence commanding attention as he prepared to reveal the full scope of his educational vision. The firelight cast dramatic shadows across his face, giving him the appearance of a prophet about to deliver a revelation that would reshape human understanding. Rousseau asks how we can educate without corruption, but he fails to grasp the fundamental structure of reality itself. Allow me to explain what true education entails and why the formation of the soul must take precedence over the training of citizens. He gestured broadly, as if painting an invisible picture in the air. Imagine, if you will, a perfectly just society, not the chaotic democracies we see around us, where opinion masquerades as knowledge and might makes right, but a republic organized according to eternal principles of justice and wisdom. Several students leaned forward, drawn into Plato's vision despite themselves. In such a society, education would begin before birth, with the careful selection of parents who possess the virtues necessary to produce virtuous offspring. The community would raise children together, ensuring that their earliest experiences reflect harmony rather than conflict, beauty rather than ugliness, truth rather than deception. Rousseau scoffed audibly. You speak of children as if they were breeding stock to be managed by philosopher bureaucrats. Where is human freedom in this perfect republic of yours? Freedom? Plato turned to face his opponent directly. What freedom exists in ignorance? What choice is meaningful when the soul lacks the capacity to distinguish between good and evil, truth and falsehood, justice and injustice? Your natural children, left to their own devices, become slaves to their appetites, prisoners of their immediate circumstances. He began to pace, his voice building with passionate intensity. True freedom comes only when reason rules the soul, when the spirited element serves rational purposes, when appetite is properly subordinated to higher goods. This requires systematic education from the earliest age. Consider the curriculum I propose, Plato continued, warming to his theme. First, we shape the soul through music and poetry, but only music and poetry that reflects eternal harmonies, only stories that inspire virtue rather than vice. We eliminate the chaotic rhythms and false tales that corrupt young minds. A music student in the back raised her hand tentatively. But Professor Plato, who determines which music reflects eternal harmonies, and doesn't exposure to different styles help us develop our own aesthetic judgment? Plato smiled paternally. My dear student, that question reveals precisely the confusion I am trying to dispel. You speak of developing your own aesthetic judgment as if beauty were a matter of personal preference. But beauty is no more subjective than mathematical truth. The soul recognizes genuine beauty when it has been properly prepared to see it. This is exactly my point, Rousseau interjected, unable to contain himself. You would create aesthetic totalitarians convinced they possess the one true understanding of beauty, art, music, literature. Your students would graduate as sophisticated automatons, incapable of genuine creative response. Plato remained unperturbed. And your students would graduate as sophisticated relativists, convinced that all opinions are equally valid, unable to distinguish between genuine art and mere entertainment, between wisdom and cleverness, between justice and the preferences of the moment. He turned back to the larger audience. After musical education comes gymnastics, not mere physical training, but the harmonious development of body and soul together. A well-educated person possesses both physical courage and intellectual virtue, both bodily discipline and mental clarity. Then comes the crucial stage, mathematics and dialectic. Through the study of number, geometry, and logical reasoning, the soul learns to think abstractly, to move beyond the world of appearances toward the realm of pure forms. Only those who master this stage can proceed to the highest level of education. Professor Chen watched as several students took notes frantically, trying to capture the full scope of Plato's systematic approach. The final stage, Plato continued, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper, is the study of philosophy itself, the direct contemplation of the good, the beautiful, the just. Those who achieve this level become philosopher kings, equipped to rule not through force or persuasion, but through their direct knowledge of eternal truth. And there it is! Rousseau exploded from his chair. The tyranny hidden at the heart of your beautiful system. These philosopher kings, these perfect souls you have created, they return to rule over everyone else. Your education produces rulers and subjects, masters and slaves, all justified by claims to superior knowledge. Plato's expression grew stern. Would you prefer rule by the ignorant? Government by those who mistake shadows for reality? Democracy has shown us where such preferences lead, to demagogues who promise impossible things, to mob rule that sacrifices justice for convenience, to the triumph of appetite over reason. The philosopher kings rule not for their own benefit but for the good of all. They have transcended personal interest through their education. They see clearly what others see only dimly. This is not tyranny but salvation. Salvation! Rousseau's voice rang with incredulous anger. You offer salvation through the elimination of human agency, through the creation of a perfect prison where everyone knows their place and no one questions the established order. Your philosopher kings become gods, and everyone else becomes their grateful worshippers. The room crackled with tension. What had begun as an academic debate was becoming a fundamental conflict between two incompatible visions of human nature and social organization. Plato straightened to his full height, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. The soul yearns for order, Rousseau. It seeks its proper place in the cosmic hierarchy of being. My education simply reveals what the soul already knows but has forgotten, that happiness comes through virtue, virtue through knowledge, and knowledge through submission to eternal truth. The battle lines had never been clearer, and the most explosive confrontation was yet to come. Rousseau had been quiet during Plato's grand exposition, but his stillness was not passive. He sat with the coiled energy of someone preparing to strike at the very foundation of his opponent's worldview. When he finally rose, his movement was swift and decisive. My dear Plato, you have just described the most sophisticated system of human oppression ever conceived, and you have done so with such eloquence that some in this room are actually nodding in agreement. His voice carried a mixture of sadness and fierce determination. He walked among the students, making eye contact with several. Let me tell you what I see in your perfect republic. I see children torn from their families before they can form natural bonds of affection. I see young minds force-fed approved stories and approved music until they lose the capacity for independent aesthetic response. I see the systematic destruction of everything that makes us human. But Rousseau, one of the students interjected, surely some guidance is necessary. Without structure, don't children become chaotic and self-destructive? Rousseau paused, his expression softening. Of course children need guidance, my young friend, but there is a crucial difference between guidance that respects their nature and manipulation that violates it. When we force children to conform to artificial standards, we teach them to distrust their own experience, to seek approval rather than understanding, to obey rather than think. He returned to face Plato directly. You speak of the soul's yearning for order, but whose order? The order that emerges naturally from human development, or the order imposed by those who claim superior knowledge? In your system, who watches the watchers? Who educates the educators? Who ensures that your philosopher kings do not become the very tyrants they claim to prevent? The truth itself constrains them, Plato replied firmly. Those who truly know the good cannot act against it. Evil comes from ignorance, not knowledge. And there lies the fatal flaw in your entire system. Rousseau's voice rose with passionate conviction. You assume that knowledge and virtue are identical, that understanding truth automatically produces good behavior. But history shows us repeatedly that the most educated people are often the most capable of sophisticated evil. He began to pace again, his energy barely contained. Consider the slaveholders who quoted scripture to justify their brutality, the scientists who conducted horrific experiments in the name of knowledge, the philosophers who built elegant theories to excuse their own privileges. Your system would create more such monsters, not fewer. Professor Chen noticed several students shifting uncomfortably. The examples Rousseau cited were all too familiar from their history courses. Human beings are naturally good, Rousseau continued, his voice growing more personal, more intimate. Not perfect, not wise, but good. Children feel genuine compassion before they learn to rationalize it away. They share naturally before they are taught to compete. They tell the truth before they discover the advantages of deception. These natural virtues are not abstract principles to be contemplated, but living realities to be nurtured. When we respect children's natural development, when we create environments where their goodness can flourish, we produce citizens capable of genuine moral choice. Plato shook his head slowly. But Jean-Jacques, you are describing sentiment, not virtue. These natural impulses you celebrate are unreliable, changeable, driven by immediate circumstances rather than universal principles. True virtue requires constancy, requires the soul's alignment with eternal truth. Eternal truth, Rousseau laughed, but the sound carried no humor. Show me this eternal truth, Plato. Point to it, touch it, demonstrate its existence beyond the claims of those who profit from believing in it. What you call eternal truth, I call the prejudices of the powerful, dressed up in philosophical language. He moved closer to the assembled students. Listen carefully to what your professor is really proposing. He wants to remove you from your families, control your reading, dictate your music, manage your exercise, direct your thinking, and determine your role in society. All for your own good, of course. All in service of eternal truths that only he and his fellow philosophers can properly understand. This is not education, Rousseau declared, his voice ringing with moral outrage. This is indoctrination of the most sophisticated kind. It produces not wise souls but broken spirits, not philosopher kings, but intellectual slaves who have learned to love their chains. The room fell silent. Even Plato seemed momentarily taken aback by the force of Rousseau's condemnation. Rousseau continued, but now his tone became more constructive, more hopeful. True education begins with respect for the child's natural curiosity. Instead of forcing predetermined knowledge into young minds, we create environments where discovery becomes possible. Instead of demanding obedience to authority, we teach critical thinking and independent judgment. We educate for citizenship, not rulership. We prepare young people to participate as equals in democratic society, not to dominate or submit to others. We trust that human beings, given genuine opportunities for moral development, will choose cooperation over conflict, justice over oppression, freedom over security. And when they choose poorly, Plato asked quietly, when natural goodness proves insufficient to prevent cruelty, injustice, warfare, when democratic citizens elect demagogues or support policies that harm the vulnerable. Rousseau met his gaze steadily. Then we accept the consequences of freedom rather than embrace the certainties of tyranny. Better a flawed democracy than a perfect dictatorship. Better citizens who make mistakes than subjects who never get the chance to choose. The philosophical battle had reached its climax, but neither combatant showed signs of yielding. The fundamental question remained: should education form souls according to eternal truths, or develop citizens capable of creating their own truths? The answer would determine not just how these students learned, but how they lived. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Two of history's greatest minds stood facing each other across an intellectual chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The students and faculty sat transfixed, watching a debate that would reshape their understanding of education's fundamental purpose. Plato broke the silence, his voice carrying a new quality. Not the confident authority of before, but something deeper, more urgent. Rousseau, your faith in human nature is admirable, but it ignores the evidence of our senses. Look around you, at the poverty, the violence, the injustice that characterizes human society. If people are naturally good, why does evil flourish? Because, Rousseau replied immediately, we have created institutions that corrupt natural goodness. Private property teaches us to be selfish. Artificial hierarchies teach us to dominate or submit. Competitive education teaches us to see others as obstacles rather than allies. The evil you observe is not natural, it is manufactured. But these institutions arise from human choices, Plato pressed. If humans are naturally good, why do they create corrupting systems? Your argument contradicts itself. Either we need external guidance toward virtue, or we are doomed to create our own destruction. Rousseau was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice carried a new complexity. Perhaps the truth is more nuanced than either of us has acknowledged. Perhaps humans possess a natural capacity for both good and evil, and education's role is to nurture the good while constraining the evil. A graduate student raised her hand tentatively. Professor Rousseau, are you suggesting that some external structure might be necessary after all? I am suggesting, Rousseau replied carefully, that the question is not whether to provide structure, but what kind of structure and for what purpose. Plato's structure aims to create perfect souls that will rule over imperfect ones. My structure aims to create equal citizens capable of ruling themselves. Plato leaned forward intently. But self-rule requires wisdom, Jean-Jacques. How can citizens rule themselves wisely if they lack knowledge of justice, truth, and the good? Your democratic education produces opinions, not knowledge, preferences, not principles, and your aristocratic education produces arrogance disguised as wisdom, Rousseau shot back. Your philosopher kings believe their abstract knowledge makes them superior to everyone else. They lose touch with the practical needs and genuine experiences of ordinary people. Professor Chen noticed that the debate was forcing the audience to confront their own educational assumptions. Several students were taking notes, not just on the content, but on the process itself. How these two brilliant minds engaged with fundamental disagreements. Perhaps, said a young philosophy professor from the back of the room, both approaches have merit but in different contexts. Maybe soul formation is appropriate for some students and civic education for others. Both philosophers turned to look at him, and their simultaneous disapproval was almost comical. No, Plato declared, truth is universal, justice is universal, the soul structure is universal. To suggest different educational approaches for different people is to abandon the very possibility of objective knowledge. No, Rousseau echoed with equal vehemence. Human equality is universal. The capacity for moral development is universal. To suggest that some people need soul formation while others need mere civic training is to justify permanent inequality. The professor who had asked the question sank back into his chair, chastened. Plato stood and began to pace, his movements sharp with intellectual passion. Let me ask you directly, Rousseau, in your ideal educational system, would you permit the teaching of mathematics, of logic, of scientific method? Of course, Rousseau replied, puzzled by the question. And would you permit students to reach incorrect conclusions about mathematical problems? Would you celebrate their natural expressions of mathematical opinion, even when those opinions contradict proven theorems? Rousseau hesitated. Well, no. Mathematical truth is objective and demonstrable. Exactly, Plato pounced. You admit that objective truth exists in mathematics. You acknowledge that some conclusions are correct and others are incorrect, regardless of student preferences or natural inclinations. Why do you deny the same objectivity when it comes to moral and political truth? Rousseau was quiet for a long moment, clearly grappling with the implications of Plato's argument. The room held its breath. Because, Rousseau finally said, mathematical truth can be demonstrated through reason and evidence in ways that moral truth cannot. 2 + 2 = 4 in all contexts for all people. But justice, beauty, the good life, these depend on cultural context, historical circumstances, individual temperament. Do they? Plato's voice was gentle now, almost sad. Is the prohibition against murdering innocents merely cultural preference? Is the obligation to help those in need simply historical accident? Is courage just individual temperament? Or do these reflect eternal principles that any rational soul can recognize? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Rousseau had argued. Several students were nodding thoughtfully, drawn back toward Plato's position, despite their earlier sympathy for Rousseau's democratic ideals. But Rousseau was far from defeated. His eyes narrowed with renewed determination as he prepared his most devastating response yet. Rousseau stood slowly, his movement deliberate and thoughtful. The fire had burned lower, casting the room in deeper shadows, but his presence seemed to fill the space with renewed energy. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was about to reveal something crucial. Plato, you have asked perhaps the most important question of our entire discussion. Let me answer it not with philosophy, but with observation, not with theory, but with life itself. He moved closer to the students, his eyes scanning their faces with genuine affection. Yes, the prohibition against murdering innocents seems universal. Yes, the obligation to help those in need appears in every human culture. Yes, courage manifests wherever humans face danger for worthy causes. But notice how I phrased that. These principles appear, they manifest, they emerge from human experience rather than being imposed upon it. Plato frowned, sensing where this was leading. The error in your system, Rousseau continued, is not in recognizing universal moral principles, but in assuming they require external authority to exist. Children do not learn compassion by memorizing definitions of virtue. They learn it by experiencing the joy of helping others, by feeling the pain of those who suffer, by discovering through their own moral development that cruelty diminishes everyone. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. But Professor Rousseau, doesn't that require some kind of educational structure to ensure these experiences happen? Absolutely, Rousseau replied with a smile. But the structure should facilitate natural moral development, not replace it with artificial instruction. We create communities where children experience cooperation and see its benefits. We present them with real moral choices and help them reflect on the consequences. We model the virtues we hope to nurture, rather than simply describing them. Plato had been listening intently, his expression growing more thoughtful. So you are saying that universal moral principles exist, but they emerge from proper experience rather than philosophical contemplation. I am saying, Rousseau replied carefully, that perhaps our disagreement is smaller than we thought. You believe in universal principles discovered through reason. I believe in universal capacities developed through experience. Maybe both are necessary. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. After nearly 40 minutes of passionate debate, were these two giants actually finding common ground? Professor Chen leaned forward, sensing a crucial moment in the discussion. Plato spoke slowly, almost reluctantly. Perhaps education requires both the systematic development of rational capacity and respect for natural moral instincts. Perhaps the soul needs both contemplation of eternal truth and engagement with temporal reality. Perhaps, Rousseau agreed, genuine citizens must be both morally developed individuals and rationally capable thinkers. Perhaps we educate for both soul formation and civic participation, because humans are both eternal souls and temporal creatures. A graduate student in philosophy raised his hand. Are you suggesting that your educational philosophies are complementary rather than contradictory? Both philosophers paused, considering this possibility seriously for the first time. Not exactly, Plato said carefully. Our methods remain quite different. I still believe systematic rational training must take precedence, that proper soul formation provides the foundation for all other learning. And I still believe, Rousseau added, that respect for natural development must come first, that civic education prepares the ground where individual wisdom can grow. But perhaps, Plato continued thoughtfully, a complete education requires both approaches at different stages or in different proportions. Perhaps, Rousseau mused, the goal is to produce human beings who can both think clearly about eternal principles and act wisely in temporal circumstances, who possess both philosophical depth and practical judgment. The students looked around at each other, realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary. Instead of a battle with a clear winner, they had seen two great minds wrestle with complexity until they found deeper truth. Professor Chen stood up, preparing to conclude the evening. Gentlemen, what you have shown us tonight is that the greatest questions admit no easy answers. Education remains an ongoing experiment in human development, requiring both the systematic pursuit of truth and respect for natural human capacity. Indeed, Plato nodded. Perhaps the soul formation I advocate and the civic education Rousseau champions are not opposite goals but complementary aspects of full human development. Perhaps, Rousseau agreed with a slight smile, education at its best helps us become both the philosophers Plato admires and the citizens I hope to cultivate. thoughtful, virtuous, engaged human beings capable of both contemplation and action. As the evening wound down and the audience began to disperse, the two philosophers shook hands with mutual respect. Their fundamental disagreements remained, but their shared commitment to human flourishing through education had created an unexpected bond. The students filed out in animated discussion, their understanding of education forever changed by witnessing how great minds can disagree productively while seeking truth together. The debate between soul formation and civic education would continue in classrooms and communities around the world, but tonight had shown that perhaps the question itself was more important than any single answer. Education, they had learned, is not about choosing between eternal truth and temporal wisdom, but about helping human beings develop the capacity for both. The conversation would continue, and that continuation was perhaps the most important lesson of all.